Hello, my name's Chris Henry. I'm a subject tutor in politics, philosophy and sociology at the Department of International Programmes at the University of Kent, and I'm a junior research fellow in the Centre for Critical Thought. I work on the interrelation of political and social systems and decision theory and ethics in artificial intelligence. And I'm going to be talking to you about the concept of resilience in the context of governmental and non-governmental organisations and the extent to which they're changing their relationship with us as citizens. It's often said that the primary duty of a political organisation, specifically the state, is to provide security for its citizens. This is being changed at the moment from one of providing security to its citizens to one whereby states provide a context and the conditions for which citizens can provide security for themselves. So more and more, the state is no longer being used to guarantee security, but we are responsible and states facilitate this. This is being done in the context of what's often called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a big sort of wide term, can be used to mean a lot of things. I'm going to mean it in the sense that Hayek, Friedman and Schultz developed it, in which they say that the market is no longer just a way of organising production and consumption of goods and services, but increasingly it actually defines what we think of as being good in the first place. Now, there are two approaches to resilience thinking. Some people in the literature argue that resilience thinking is a good thing. They say that it's actually an anti-neoliberal tool. It encourages us to take responsibility for our own lives, not to be quite as slavish to a state. And they use, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic as an example for this. They point to the fact that we would keep distance between ourselves, we would abide the laws, we would go above and beyond helping our neighbours and our friends out when they needed it, often without the state's intervention whatsoever. There are some people, however, that say that resilience is not quite as good as this, and resilience takes on a negative tone when contrasted against state security. They say that actually it's a form of neoliberalism in itself, it's a fragmenting of society, and it's a breaking apart of our responsibilities towards each other. And the fact that the idea that we can tackle climate change or terrorism or combatants in war ourselves is just fanciful. And instead what states are doing is they're relinquishing control of security, and they're keeping all of the power and the control over money for themselves. Now, resilience thinking is grounded, whether you agree with it or you disagree with it, upon complexity theory. And complexity theory is a body of literature that argues that the world is so fundamentally unknowable, not because it's just a bit complicated, but because the complex processes that make it up are independent from each other, but so radically complex that we can't possibly understand them. Issues such as conflict, environmental degradation, political persecution and things like this, they're surface effects of processes that are too complex to be grappled with at a top-down level. And governments protest only the capacity to provide citizens with resources to develop their own capacity for resilience, and they abrogate the responsibility of addressing issues themselves. Let's take an example. This is perhaps a bit abstract. One example is life. So politicians might say, we need to secure life. We need to guarantee the quality of human life. But what do they mean by life? If life is so complex, if the world is so complex, what do we mean when we talk about life as a set of processes? How can we make life more resilient to external threats? As you can see in this slide, recent body of literature doesn't do a very good job, I think, of articulating what life or other sort of metaphysical concepts might mean. So they say maybe life is vital, emergent, productive, maybe it's not. Maybe the world can be put to work in manifold ways, maybe not. And in recognizing that the world is ontologically complex, accepting that its processes are radically complex, but concluding that we cannot actually therefore grasp them, there's a sense that resilience thinkers trying to legitimately grasp and effectively address sociological problems, but actually don't manage to do it. There's no guarantee that a focus on virtual processes, life in this case, will have any meaningful or beneficial impact on the actual lives of living individuals. If this is the case, then the abrogation of responsibility for understanding complexity amounts to a political capitulation to the neoliberal thought originally the target of neoliberal thinkers. So we need to rethink how an understanding of the radically complex world can help us still make meaningful, helpful, and accountable socio-political interventions. I'm going to turn to some metaphysics now. Metaphysics can be messy, abstract, but I'm going to hopefully draw out two strands in metaphysical thinking, articulate why they are, in my opinion, the wrong way to go about thinking about complexity, and then explain why process philosophy is the right way to go about thinking about it. So hopefully this slide sheds some light on substantialism, the first of the metaphysical principles. According to substantialism, the world is made of, at the very fundamental level, essential building blocks. And the sort of foundational idea here is that there are atoms floating in space. Nowadays we might think of them being quarks, but nevertheless there are sort of foundational building blocks. And the rules for identifying what these foundational building blocks come to be, the objects, the events that sort of make up our world, are inherent to these building blocks. They're somehow written into the fabric of them. The problem with this metaphysical position and how it helps or doesn't help understand the world around us is that an explanation of the rules that form the objects must themselves be grounded on an explanation, but this explanation is resting on the assumptions that the substantialists are making. We've therefore got an infinite regress to meaninglessness, something that Agrippan skepticism argues. The second metaphysical position, hylomorphism, says that there are no essential building blocks to life. The rules for identifying objects and how they emerge are separate from the objects themselves. So I think this is an important development. An example, might be a chair. So a chair is identified because wood and nails come together with a production technique involved. The problem with hylomorphism, however, is that it requires an archetype, an example from which we know everything else. So a chair, for example, we might say a chair is a wooden thing with 4 legs that we sit on. But we can imagine maybe a chair with 5 legs, or that's made from plastic. Is that a chair? Is that not a chair? Well, we have to constantly expand our definition of chairs, again leading to a notion of chair that is ultimately meaningless. Now, the key problem here is that we miss out or we exclude what the Greeks called techne, or we can just call art, craft, or an individual's agency in the act of identifying things. So we accept in everyday life that no actual chair we encounter will be exactly the same as the idea of the chair we have in our minds. But in practical terms, the difference between the two is rarely of importance. The differences between the two are either ignored or sort of incorporated into the idea of the form of the chair. Markets can encourage us to value some things over others. And if we don't focus upon how we understand the world, and this is why I think this is important, we remain open to market forces that encourage us to engage in practices that are detrimental to us, or understand the world in ways that might not help us individually. An example for this is the Google PageRank algorithm, which governs how things appear to us when we search for something on Google. Of course, the PageRank algorithm was designed to make Alphabet money. It wouldn't exist in the Google page unless it was somehow beneficially impacting the share value of Google. But it determines very fundamentally how most of us go about knowing about the world. What do we do when we want to know something? We Google something. But that PageRank algorithm determines in a very real way the sorts of things that are presented to us for knowledge. And as 80% of internet searches are on Google, Google fundamentally affects how we understand the world. And if we don't account for this in how we know the world, we're going to be at the detriment of the neoliberalism that resilience thinkers tried to resist. So how might we go about including techne or craft in our understanding of the world and better understand the complexity of it? Well, I draw from James Williams and his process philosophy of signs lessons here, and it's his process philosophy of signs that I want to present as a way of doing this. So as you can see on this slide, James says that objects, or what we might call signs, are sets of component parts. So one sign would be A, B, C, three parts that might sort of make up this sign. Slightly more concretely, we might say cat sitting mat, right, to give us a presentation of, the cat sat on the mat, a situation in front of us. Or learning, student, research, might be a university. However, realizing that this definition of university leaves out the economic context in which the university exists allows us to create a new set that includes this economic context. We can then do two things. One, we have a new object of study. What is the nature of a university in an economic context? And what is the nature of the university outside of that economic context? Does it mean anything at all? The second thing is it foregrounds the politics in identification. What it shows us is that somebody, whoever defined the university without its economic context, might have a reason for doing so. Why might they want us to think about the university as if it didn't fit in with a global learning environment and a global economy that takes students and puts them into a job, like that's the function of a university in the first place? So the realization that the definition of university leaves out its economic context does these two things, and it shows us that identification is inherently political. Highlighting what is included and excluded in definitions does two things. One, it allows us to understand complex processes in the first place. Things aren't out there just to be discovered, but things require us to build a sense of the world which will change as we learn more of it. And as we learn more of the world, we'll be able to discover things, discover processes, describe them in more detail, including and excluding features of them as we see fit. The second thing it will allow us to do is identify when others include or exclude aspects of the world as well. For example, British complicity in the wars from which refugees flee might be ignored, and thus we might ignore the moral obligation to take in those refugees when they reach our shores. But including British complicity in these wars in the definition of the process that the refugees are taking would insert this obligation to at least consider taking in these refugees. So what then is this life that I mentioned earlier? How might an account of life as process inform resilience thinking? Well, it won't do to answer these questions whilst resting upon a suggestion that life may be vital, it may be emergent or productive, or that it may not, and it's not clear from this where we might go. Political contradictions have real effects upon marginalised communities and demand of resilience thinkers that they commit to firmer and more rigorous political analysis than this. Processes do not exist externally from their identification, their selection, and the extent to which they rest upon background assumptions. Drawing up suites of sets serves to differentially challenge, confirm, and politicise the world, reminding us that our sense of the world is inextricably caught up in the way it actually is. The second reason why we cannot rest upon this suggestion is because it presents too simple a set of options from which to choose. Both Anthropocene resilience thinkers and their critics alike do recognise the complexity of processes. To the extent that no simple description will suffice, we must recognise that the relational nature of the world in which we live and adopt a language in order to live in it well. However, we've seen that the language of substantialism refers to a set of inherent properties according to which the world is supposed to act. We've also seen that the language of hylomorphism refers to the governing principles that form an otherwise inert matter and is therefore highly suited to this neoliberal governmental set of practices. Both languages should be dispensed with for their tendency to depoliticize situations and encourage us towards lazy generalizations and the acceptance of authority. This is the challenge to which Williams' process philosophy of sign rises. A life is not singular, and the more universal class of life, where the latter is yet to be defined, we must reverse the priority. Life, and even the life of a sign, can be defined by the stipulation within a given situation. in the recognition that this stipulation never totalizes an explanation. Black life can be selected against the background diagrams of white or trans life, colonialism and extinction, or civil rights, without necessary opposition, but rather with the opportunity for further critical examination. The language of Williams' process philosophy prevents a functional identity with neoliberalism by highlighting the latter's lack of concern for the actual lives that are being governed. It gives priority instead to active verbs that stress the importance of not virtual conditions, but actual intensive processes: select, define, interact. Through its critical capacity and in recognition of these actually complex processes, we're encouraged to introduce alternative positions and potential into debates and activities, rather than assume the virtues of our otherwise principled but distanced view of the world. Adopting the language of process philosophy will thus engender significant critical tools to combine with proposals for new signs, whilst remaining committed to actually complex processes. Thank you.